It is the bitter winter of 1945, January 14th, deep in the snow-laden forests of Bavaria, Germany. The war had officially ended weeks ago, yet the scars of conflict lingered in every frostbitten branch and frozen footpath. Smoke from distant villages mingled with the crisp, biting air, carrying faint echoes of distant artillery and the occasional crackle of collapsing rooftops. Amid this silent devastation, the bodies of the most vulnerable lay forgotten. Elderly German grandmothers, shivering in tattered coats, their hands curled around remnants of blankets, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The ground beneath them was a patchwork of frozen mud, broken branches, and scattered debris, making every movement a perilous ordeal. For days, these women had been left to survive on their own, their cries muted by the vast, empty forest, their strength dwindling with each passing hour. And yet, through the whitened haze of despair, a group of U.S. soldiers emerged, men worn by war, faces etched with exhaustion, yet driven by an unspoken humanity. Their boots crunched against ice, rifles slung over shoulders, eyes scanning for life amid the devastation. With careful steps and averted glances toward the past, they moved closer to the fragile figures, hearts heavy with the weight of responsibility and hope. In that frozen clearing, under a sky bruised with the gray of approaching night, the world seemed suspended between despair and salvation. Every heartbeat, every shiver, every whispered plea became a part of the forest itself, a testament to endurance, compassion, and the thin thread of humanity that persisted even after years of unimaginable violence. The soldiers moved cautiously through the frozen underbrush, the brittle twigs snapping under their boots like brittle bones, each step a reminder of the unforgiving terrain that surrounded them. The forest was thick with the remnants of war, shattered branches, splintered trunks, and the occasional rusted relic half buried in the snow. The cold gnawed at their fingers, the wind slicing through coats and scarves, carrying with it a pungent mixture of smoke, decaying vegetation, and the faint, unmistakable metallic tang of blood lingering from battles past. Their eyes scanned constantly, alert for both threats and the fragile life they had been tasked to save, aware that the grandmother's survival hung in the delicate balance between human compassion and the merciless cruelty of circumstance. As they approached a small clearing, the sight that greeted them was almost too much to bear. Huddled against a half-collapsed wooden shed, their faces pale and lined with the deep etchings of hardship, were the grandmothers. Their breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps, the steam rising in tiny clouds before freezing midair. Their clothing, thin and insufficient against the merciless winter, clung to them in sodden, mud-streaked layers. Some had blankets draped around their frail shoulders, torn and tattered, the fabric hanging in damp, uneven strips. Their eyes, wide and glassy with exhaustion, reflected both fear and a faint glimmer of hope at the sight of the approaching soldiers. There was an almost surreal stillness to the moment. The women barely moved, yet every shiver and subtle twitch of their hands communicated the magnitude of their suffering. The soldiers' own emotions were a mixture of grim determination and deep empathy. They had seen death and destruction in its rawest form across battlefields, but nothing had prepared them for the fragility of human life when stripped of all dignity and care. One of the younger soldiers, barely 20, swallowed hard as he knelt beside an elderly woman whose hands were frostbitten and curled around her knees, shaking uncontrollably. He whispered gentle words, a mix of English and the few German phrases he had learned, attempting to bridge the chasm of fear and alienation. The woman's lips trembled as she attempted a reply, her voice faint, cracked, almost swallowed by the wind. Another soldier helped lift a frail figure from the snow, the grandmother leaning heavily on his shoulder, as though her entire weight was the sum of decades of hardship and deprivation. Every movement was painstaking, each step carried the potential for disaster, yet retreat was unthinkable. Around them, the forest seemed to hold its breath. A distant crow cawed, echoing through the bare branches, and the occasional groan of ice shifting under fallen logs punctuated the otherwise oppressive silence. The snow beneath the women's feet was crusted with ice in places and soft in others, forcing the soldiers to adjust their footing constantly. They could smell the earthy rot of leaves and damp wood, the stench mingling with the faint scent of the women themselves, a mixture of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and the underlying scent of sickness and weakness. One soldier, his jaw tight with concentration, noticed the deep bruises and cuts on a woman's arms and legs, remnants of falls, frostbite, or perhaps even prior neglect. The sight hardened his resolve. There was no room for hesitation. Lives depended on the next few hours, and every decision carried weight beyond imagination. The grandmother's reactions were varied. Some clung instinctively to the soldiers' arms, their fingernails biting into fabric as though fear itself had taken physical form. Others could barely lift their heads, their eyes following the soldiers with a mixture of wonder and terror, trusting strangers entirely because they had no one else left to trust. There was a palpable tension in the air, the fear of being abandoned, the pain of hunger and cold, and the raw, almost desperate hope that someone would save them. As the soldiers assessed who could walk and who required full assistance, they improvised stretchers from splintered wood and canvas, tying them securely, though every knot seemed a fragile promise against the backdrop of such extreme conditions. The process of gathering the women was slow, deliberate, and laborious. Each soldier had to balance strength and tenderness, lifting bodies that had become heavy with weakness, guiding trembling limbs over snow, covered roots, and hidden pits in the forest floor. At times, a grandmother would cry out in pain, startled by the movement or the biting cold, and the soldiers would respond with murmured reassurances, soft hands against skin, small gestures of humanity in the midst of unrelenting hardship. The icy wind whipped through the trees, tugging at coats and hats, yet no amount of discomfort could deter them. They worked in silent coordination, each understanding the role they played in this small but monumental act of rescue. There were no orders shouted, no commands given, only the unspoken acknowledgement that every heartbeat, every breath, every careful step was a defiance of death itself. Throughout this ordeal, memories of home and loved ones flickered through the soldiers' minds. Some were reminded of their own grandmothers, now safe far away, knitting or baking, unaware of the atrocities and abandonment that lingered in war-torn Europe. That thought fueled them forward, giving them an almost tangible energy despite their aching muscles, frostbitten fingers, and frozen toes. They adjusted their grips, shifted weights, and reminded one another to breathe, all while navigating the frozen, treacherous terrain. There was the crunch of snow, the subtle snapping of frozen twigs, the whisper of the wind through skeletal branches, the occasional grunt as a soldier adjusted a grandmother's position, and the faint, fragile sighs of relief or fear from the women themselves. Time itself seemed to stretch, each minute drawn out by the sheer difficulty of movement. They had to cross a narrow, root-laden path over a small creek, ice, slicked and perilous, and soldiers steadied the women with both arms, guiding their feet, holding stretchers, offering words of encouragement. The women's faces betrayed fatigue beyond description, hollowed eyes, drawn cheeks, lips chapped and blue from the biting cold. Yet amid that suffering, there was a glimmer of gratitude, a subtle nod, a whispered, "Danke," a gesture that reminded the soldiers why they endured this grueling. By the time they reached a slightly more open clearing, a sense of fragile progress had set in. The women were still weak, shivering, and in need of immediate care, but the first stage of rescue had been accomplished. The soldiers paused briefly to assess their numbers, to redistribute weight, to whisper a quiet prayer or offer a comforting word. They looked around at the devastation, broken branches, snow, packed undergrowth, the skeletal remains of burnt-out huts, and realized the magnitude of their task. Every step forward was a victory, every careful lift of a frail body a triumph over the indifference of war. It was in this moment, amidst the frozen forest, the snow reflecting a gray, overcast sky, that the first true sense of hope began to take hold. The grandmothers, though fragile and wary, had survived the first stage of their ordeal, and the soldiers had proven that courage and compassion could endure even when the world had been stripped of all else. Each movement, each gesture, each careful placement of hands and feet became a testament to human perseverance, a quiet defiance against the cruelty and neglect that had left these women on the brink of death. The forest around them, harsh and unyielding, seemed to hold its breath in acknowledgement of this fragile triumph. The first few steps out of the clearing were deceptively simple, but the forest quickly reasserted its dominance. The ground was uneven, frozen in some places and treacherously soft in others, making every careful step a calculated risk. Soldiers shifted their burdens, adjusting the weight of stretchers or the arms of frail grandmothers leaning heavily against them. Each footfall was accompanied by the crunch of snow under boots, a brittle sound that seemed deafening in the otherwise near-silent woods. The wind howled through the skeletal branches above, tugging at coats and scarves, sometimes snatching loose strands of hair or cloth and whipping them across faces. The cold was relentless, gnawing through gloves and coats, biting at ears and noses, stealing warmth with every passing second. The soldiers' breaths came in ragged clouds, mingling with the feeble exhalations of the women they carried, forming ephemeral ghosts that vanished into the gray winter sky. As they moved further, the strain became increasingly visible. Muscles ached, back stiffened, and fingers that had long ago grown numb with cold protested every motion. The stretchers, while sturdily constructed, flexed under the uneven weight, threatening to tip with each misstep. The soldiers communicated in soft murmurs, careful instructions and reassurances blending into the rhythm of boots against snow, the occasional snap of a branch, and the sighs of exhaustion from the women themselves. One soldier gritted his teeth, sweat freezing in his hairline despite the bitter cold, as he carefully lowered a stretcher over a fallen log, holding his breath until the frail body above was safely cleared. Another whispered to a trembling grandmother, guiding her weak legs across a patch of ice, offering a hand and gentle encouragement, as though sheer force of will could steady the fragile body. The women's suffering was palpable. Shivering violently, they pressed their faces into soldiers' shoulders or the arms of their companions, seeking warmth and security. Their lips were blue, chapped, and cracked from dehydration and frostbite. Their eyes, wide with exhaustion, seemed to hold the weight of decades of hardship, war, and neglect. Some whispered prayers under their breath, voices barely audible, carried away instantly by the wind. The soldiers, too, felt the emotional weight, each frail body a silent accusation against the world, a reminder of the cruelty and neglect that had left them on the brink of death. The men's determination hardened with every step, driven not only by duty but by an instinctive recognition that human life, in its most vulnerable form, deserved protection, no matter the cost. Hours passed, measured only by the gradual sinking of the winter sun, and the deepening shadows that stretched across the forest floor. The path became increasingly treacherous, small ravines filled with icy water, mud-laden tracks, and fallen branches that threatened to trip both soldiers and the fragile women they carried. They moved in methodical patterns, alternating who bore the heaviest burdens, pausing only when absolutely necessary to rest aching limbs or adjust a stretcher. Every pause was a delicate dance. Too long, and frostbite would set in; too short, and exhaustion could collapse both carrier and carried. The women offered small gestures of gratitude, a hand squeezed, a murmured, "Danky," or a faint nod of the head, their bodies still trembling but their trust growing with each careful step. At one particularly difficult stretch, the soldiers had to cross a small frozen stream. The ice cracked ominously under their weight, a reminder that danger was never far from these fragile lives. One soldier held a grandmother in his arms, testing each step cautiously before transferring his weight forward. A sharp crack of ice beneath them made his heart leap, but he forced calm into his voice, instructing another soldier to secure the stretcher on the other side. The women, sensing tension, pressed closer, their fragile fingers gripping sleeves and coats as if physical contact could somehow ward off disaster. The wind rose, whistling through the barren trees, carrying a bitter reminder that nature itself was as much an adversary as any human force. Meals had long been forgotten, and hunger gnawed at both the soldiers and the women, though it was the grandmothers who felt it most acutely. Cold, empty stomachs made every step feel heavier, every movement more arduous. Soldiers shared small scraps of chocolate or hard biscuits, pressing them into hands that shook violently, their eyes lighting briefly with gratitude before the exhaustion reclaimed them. The smell of damp clothing, sweat, and human fatigue mixed with the icy scent of pine and snow, creating an atmosphere that was both oppressive and intimate, a reminder of how closely survival depended on human cooperation. As the hours stretched on, fatigue became a constant companion. Soldiers' boots were soaked through, fingers stiff, faces pale from cold and exertion. Their own minds threatened to wander into despair, but the sight of the grandmothers, their fragile determination shining through exhaustion, kept them moving. One soldier, whispering under his breath, reminded himself that every careful step was not just a march across a forest, but a march against the indifference of the world, a declaration that human life, even when fragile and aged, mattered. The terrain alternated between dense thickets and open snowfields, each presenting its own challenges. In the thickets, limbs snagged on branches, forcing soldiers to lift and maneuver their charges with precision. In open fields, the wind cut through every layer of clothing, and visibility was low, the gray sky blending seamlessly with the white snow. Through it all, there was a rhythm, steps, breaths, whispers, shivers, and the occasional reassuring squeeze of a hand. The forest, though indifferent, seemed to shift in acknowledgement of the small but monumental act unfolding within it. As night approached, darkness began to settle over the forest, making each step more treacherous. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the snow, obscuring holes, roots, and frozen obstacles. Soldiers adjusted, using flashlights sparingly, mindful that the sudden glare could startle the women or reveal their position to any lurking dangers. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on eyelashes, brows, and the tips of noses. Yet despite this unrelenting adversity, they pressed on, driven by a shared understanding that turning back was unthinkable. The women, though visibly weakened, displayed a quiet resilience, leaning into the soldiers' support, drawing strength from their presence, and showing a human will to survive that matched the soldiers' determination to save them. Hours turned into what felt like an eternity, muscles screaming in protest, bodies numb, minds teetering on exhaustion. But step by step, carefully and painstakingly, the 12-mile journey continued. Soldiers reminded each other to maintain a steady pace, to check on the women's condition constantly, to adjust stretchers and grips as needed. The forest around them was a harsh, unforgiving witness, snow-laden branches sagging, frost clinging to bark, and the faint groans of settling ice echoing in the distance. Yet within this oppressive environment, there existed a fragile bubble of humanity, a testament to courage, compassion, and the enduring will to protect those who could not protect themselves. Finally, in the distance, a faint glow suggested the first signs of habitation. A farmhouse, a distant light in the darkness, or perhaps the hint of a village. It was the promise of warmth, shelter, and medical care, the goal toward which every weary limb and shivering body had been pushing. Soldiers encouraged the women, whispering words of reassurance, steadying them over the last icy ridges, and taking on every burden that could be borne in that final stretch. Though exhaustion threatened to topple both soldiers and grandmothers, the thought of survival, of reaching help, lent them renewed strength. In those final miles, the forest seemed to open slightly, as if yielding to the determination of those who refused to surrender. Snow-crusted branches bent back, revealing glimpses of the path ahead. The wind, though still biting, seemed less cruel, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and human habitation, a promise of relief. Every step forward was a small triumph, a victory over the elements, over exhaustion, over despair itself. The soldiers' focus never wavered. The grandmother's trust never faltered. Together, they moved through the night, a moving testament to the endurance of the human spirit. The forest gradually began to thin, and with it came the faint but unmistakable scent of smoke and human habitation. The promise of warmth and shelter pulled the soldiers and their fragile charges forward, each step a mixture of hope and exhaustion. Every muscle ached, every finger burned with frostbite, and yet the drive to deliver these grandmothers to safety outweighed any pain. The women themselves, though pale and shivering, had begun to show signs of recognition that the end of this ordeal was near. Their movements, once tentative and hesitant, were now bolstered by the presence of care, their trust in the soldiers translating into a small but noticeable lift in their posture. As they entered a clearing at the edge of the forest, the first structures of a small medical outpost became visible through the trees. Smoke curled from chimneys and the glow of lanterns pierced the deepening dusk, reflecting off the icy snow. The sight was almost surreal after hours of trudging through desolate woods and frozen underbrush. Soldiers exchanged brief nods, a silent acknowledgement of the journey that had brought them here, and redoubled their efforts to cross the final stretch. Every footfall carried the weight of survival, a silent testament to the extraordinary effort required to save these lives. The grandmothers clung with trembling hands to the soldiers' arms, some whispering fragments of words, prayers, thanks, or simply gasps of relief, as they were carefully guided toward safety. At the edge of the clearing, the first medical personnel emerged, drawn by the muffled sounds of snow crunching and faint voices. Nurses and medics rushed forward, faces set with concern, their hands ready to take over the care that had been precariously maintained during the long trek. The soldiers, exhausted but resolute, lowered the stretchers and gently helped the grandmothers onto makeshift beds. There was a flurry of activity as blankets were wrapped around trembling bodies, warm water applied to frostbitten hands and feet, and first aid was administered with urgency and precision. The women, many of whom had not felt comfort in days, closed their eyes in relief, their lips parting in shallow, almost imperceptible sighs that carried a weight of gratitude far beyond words. For the soldiers, the release of burden was both a relief and a bitter reflection. Their bodies ached, their hands were raw and blistered, but there was a quiet triumph in the knowledge that each life they had carried through snow and ice, through thickets and frozen streams, had survived. They watched as the medical personnel worked tirelessly, their eyes scanning over each grandmother for signs of frostbite, malnutrition, and exhaustion. The grim realities of war were still present. The skeletal remains of destroyed villages, the broken and charred landscape. Yet in this small clearing, there existed a sanctuary, a fragile bastion of human compassion and care that had emerged against overwhelming odds. The emotional impact on the grandmothers was profound. Some wept quietly, tears mingling with frozen streaks of dirt and ice on their faces, the sheer release of tension and fear evident in every shiver and sob. Others held hands, fingers interlaced, eyes wide with disbelief, as though the mere act of being carried to safety was almost too much to comprehend. A few whispered thanks repeatedly, their voices trembling yet insistent, their gratitude flowing as naturally as their exhaustion. The soldiers, witnessing this, allowed themselves small gestures of relief. A hand on a shoulder, a brief nod, the tight exhalation of breath after weeks of tension and vigilance. For these men, who had witnessed destruction and despair in countless forms, this moment represented a profound, almost spiritual affirmation of the value of human life. Medical care began in earnest. Medics moved with practiced efficiency, checking for frostbite, hypothermia, dehydration, and injuries sustained during the harrowing trek. Blankets were secured, makeshift stoves provided warmth, and warm broths were administered where possible. One grandmother, barely conscious when discovered, responded slowly to the heat and care, her eyes fluttering open with a mixture of confusion and recognition. Another, who had been carried across nearly impassable terrain on a stretcher, managed a weak smile, the first sign of comfort she had experienced in days. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, warm clothing, and the faint smoke from nearby stoves, a tangible contrast to the icy, acrid cold that had dominated the previous hours. Even as relief settled over the clearing, there was a quiet acknowledgement of the enormity of what had been accomplished. 12 miles of treacherous terrain, hours of struggle through snow, ice, and mud, countless moments where life teetered on the edge, all culminated in this single, fragile victory. The soldiers, their faces etched with exhaustion and determination, allowed themselves a moment to take stock, observing the quiet gratitude of the grandmothers they had carried. Some of the women were being attended to by medics, others were resting against blankets, and all of them, in their own ways, bore witness to the resilience of human spirit, both theirs and those who had saved them. Outside the clearing, the forest remained silent, indifferent to human triumphs and suffering alike. Yet within that small patch of warmth and light, a profound sense of accomplishment hung in the air. The soldiers had acted against both nature and circumstance, their humanity guiding them through impossible conditions. They had lifted not only bodies but hope itself, carrying it through frozen woods and desolate terrain until it could finally be nurtured. The grandmother's survival was no longer tentative or uncertain. It was assured, thanks to the unwavering commitment of those who had refused to abandon them. Stories of what had transpired began to spread quietly among the medics and local inhabitants. Some were skeptical, unable to believe that the frail, elderly women had been transported such a distance under conditions so extreme. Others, however, marveled at the determination and courage exhibited by both soldiers and grandmothers alike, recognizing in that struggle a testament to the enduring resilience of the human spirit in the darkest hours. The acts of care and bravery transcended language, nationality, and even the lingering bitterness of a recently ended war, leaving behind a narrative that would echo far beyond that frozen clearing. In the quiet moments after the last grandmother was settled, soldiers huddled together, their breaths forming icy clouds in the frigid night air. They spoke softly, not of orders or strategy, but of the sheer humanity of what they had achieved. There were small smiles, brief touches on frostbitten hands, and quiet laughter, subtle but poignant acknowledgments of the shared triumph. In this space, amid blankets, lantern light, and the faint warmth of stoves, the full weight of the journey settled upon them. They had carried lives, hope, and dignity across a landscape indifferent to suffering, and in doing so, had carved a fragile sanctuary in the midst of devastation. As dawn approached, the first rays of light illuminated the clearing. The grandmothers, now resting more comfortably, slowly stirred, faces softening from fear to cautious relief. Soldiers, exhausted but vigilant, continued to monitor their charges, ensuring that warmth and sustenance were sufficient, that no lingering frostbite or injury would go unattended. The surrounding forest, once a harsh adversary, now appeared almost serene under the pale morning light, the snow reflecting a soft, forgiving glow. For a brief moment, the world seemed to pause, acknowledging the extraordinary effort that had brought life, warmth, and care to those who had been abandoned and left to die. The historical significance of this moment was not lost on anyone present. In the midst of a world recovering from unspeakable violence, this small act of courage and compassion became emblematic of the enduring power of humanity. The grandmother's survival, made possible by the tireless effort of a few determined soldiers, was a reminder that even in the darkest times, kindness, resilience, and moral courage could triumph over despair. Every shiver, every cry, every careful step had contributed to a story that would be remembered, not as an isolated act, but as a profound testament to the power of human decency in a fractured world.